Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hello, and welcome to the next episode of Decoding AQ. I have with me today Kian Gohar, who is a co-author of a new book called Competing in the New World of Work with somebody who I've followed and known for some time now, Keith Ferrazzi. He is also a executive director at XPRIZE, and just an all-round awesome guy who speaks the same sort of language as I do. So welcome, Kian.
Thanks, Ross. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
So tell me, Kian, how, if I did my internet stalking correctly as sort of the journey that people go on from VC environments, time in Asia, all of these various things, where did it all kind of start for you in terms of the journey in work? What was the sort of first entry in work? It was probably even before what you've put on LinkedIn, right? Of those things. But give me a history of what work has meant for you, and maybe a couple of the key milestones.
Well, I'll tell you this, Ross. I don't know if early on in my career I was proud of this, but I would never get jobs when I came out of college because I had a liberal arts degree that I was very proud of, and I studied history and political science and international relations, and it taught me how to read and write and think critically, which are incredibly valuable in this world. But it didn't turn into a concrete practical job or profession that I could pursue right afterwards. And so I actually found myself for the early part of my career not being able to land jobs. And so by not being able to do that, I was forced to innovate. And what I am really proud of is that I've never had a job in my entire life that I haven't created and that I've applied for. And that has been something that has been a thread throughout my last 20 years of my career. And it is something that happened by necessity, and something that I'm really proud of. And ultimately, it matches who I am and my personality. But I would say it was unplanned. And so those were the early days. And then when I did actually get a job, it was jobs that I created within new startups or new organizations. I lived in London after grad school, and I joined a startup venture capital firm. And again, I had just had a liberal arts education and really had never even opened Excel in my entire life. And everybody around me was stupefied as to how I got this job. And they said, you just have to try. And if you don't ask, and if you don't knock on doors, then you won't find out what's behind there. And so found myself early in my career in venture capital, and I loved it. And I loved working with my portfolio companies. And I realized that if I wanted to continue building and being a successful entrepreneur, I was doing this now as an investor, early stage investor in my early career. But if I really wanted to succeed, I really needed to get operating experience in an actual startup where I'm building something beyond just an investment thesis. And so many years later, after spending some time in venture capital in Asia and business school, I joined a startup in South Florida that was a manufacturer of sporting goods equipment, specifically kiteboarding. And it was a very unique experience, and everybody from my network wondered why I chose to do that. And next 5 years, we built this little startup into a good little company. And in 2005, we were on the cloud before anybody had even heard of the cloud. So we were doing really innovative stuff direct to consumer. And I just really loved it. And so when I left that, and I'll close the story out, when I left that, I ended up eventually joining Peter Diamandis at the XPRIZE Foundation in a new role that I created as a spinoff, and which was basically taking all we knew about innovation and helping large organizations learn about that. And people ask me, how did the dots connect between working in kiteboarding and then all of a sudden being behind the velvet rope in Silicon Valley? How can I do that? And I said, there is no thread that you can logically and linearly follow for that to make sense. Looking at my career backwards, I can see exactly how all the dots connect. But oftentimes you have to see where the next chapter takes you, where you want it to go, and be open to the possibilities. And you have to knock on doors.
I think it was Steve Jobs, wasn't it, who said you can only connect the dots backwards, right? Not forwards. And it's interesting, isn't it, where sometimes it's the necessity that drives the creation. Sometimes it's imagination that drives creation. And this dance between those things is interesting, and where work has been something that you have created and manifested. For many others, it is just a definition of tasks, a role, something they've been educated in, and in they go. And then they climb a ladder and get layers and layers of responsibility, and then find out quite often a disconnect moment, right? A disconnect moment from who they want to be, what their purpose is, all of these kind of things. And I'm interested in terms of, as someone who has now been not only on a very interesting journey themselves, but also done a deep research project for the book, for the Competing in the New World of Work. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe some of the things that were uncovered from that, Kian.
Yeah, so we just wrote a book. Actually, today is our publication date. I'm very proud of the book. Thank you. That has been 2 years in the making. And so the early days of the pandemic, my dear friend Keith Razi and I, we got together and we said, there's lots of clients that we coach independently, and they were struggling with the early days of the lockdown. And so this was like the spring of 2020, when we thought it was just going to last 2 months and we'll be all through it. And so he started a project called Go Forward to Work. And the idea was to crowdsource in real time best practices from CHROs, CLOs, CEOs about what they were doing during those first 2 months. And then very soon after that, we had the Summer of Racial Justice. And very quickly, we realized that the world of work was never going to be the same again. And so we ended up, what we thought would be a 2-month project is now been 2 years. And we interviewed over 2,000 executives, entrepreneurs, change makers, leaders from 300 different organizations across the world, in collaboration with Harvard Business School, to try to really understand what were the key leadership traits that the most successful teams deployed in order to withstand and survive and thrive in the last 2 years of uncertainty. And we have some great stories. And early on, I would say that everybody said that they had innovated in their business. And what they meant was that they added a digital component to their business. So they had now a digital channel. Dell Computer had a research report that 80% of businesses innovated in their business model in the early days of the pandemic. But as we continue to look and research, we found very few companies that had actually really transformed the products and services that they offered. Of course, startups do this all the time. They pivot on a constant basis to find product market fit. But for larger companies, they added a digital layer, and then they thought that was enough. And that's then we realized when companies were really struggling was because they thought that they had done enough by just going digital. And that was just a toolkit rather than the endpoint. So the surprise was that not as many companies as we thought really took the opportunity to transform over the last 2 years radically. And then all of a sudden they find themselves in the situation where there's the great resignation and people are looking for new opportunities. So it's been a fascinating journey for the last 2 years of research, and we're proud to bring the book to the public today and help inspire CHROs and CLOs and other leaders across the world take nuggets from our best practice that's very practical and then apply it to their own organizations.
And it's what brought us together was actually the book, in terms of whilst we have orbited in very similar orbits around each other, we've never connected. And it was this comment of the book, because I've got many of Keith's past books, and it was this radical adaptability. And radicals, I know something that Keith's used, radical candor, all various things. And can you define for me what is meant by radical adaptability? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so we start the book with what I believe to be actually the most interesting story. And I won't spoil it for your readers, but we start in a whiteout in the desert in northern Nevada called Black Rock Desert, where Burning Man happens. And for your listeners who may not know, Burning Man is a annual festival that lasts 7 days long. And it's held in a very hostile environment, very like Martian-like, very hot, very dusty, but yet it attracts 70,000 people every year to commune together in many different ways. And to survive in this really harsh environment where you don't know where the next dust storm will come, or sometimes where you will even get your next meal because you may not have brought enough food, as I did when I went. You have to live with a mindset that you're constantly experimenting and that you're constantly looking to reach out beyond the people you know in order to find the resources you need to be able to survive. And so the beginning of the book is a story of what it means to thrive in this harsh desert of Black Rock City in northern Nevada. And we felt the last 2 years was very similar to that, because every week things were changing. There were new sudden shifts that people never expected. And to thrive, you really had to be very, very adaptable and not just reactive, like most people are when change happens, but rather proactive and thinking about what change might happen and being able to plan for that. And so radical adaptability is a methodology that we developed after all these interviews. And we identified these 4 key leadership traits that most successful teams and companies have, and I can get into those. And we combined them into a methodology that's sustainable for a ongoing basis. And so when you're deep in a crisis, like we were in the early days of the pandemic, or if you're in a dust storm at Burning Man, you can thrive in a crisis situation, but that's not sustainable on an ongoing basis. So we wanted to take the best lessons from how people thrived and help leaders think about how they can deploy them so that they can do this sustainably methodology going forward.
Is to build those muscles, right? It's often the biggest, catastrophes that show what we're capable of. I remember a large project where we did the global rebranding for the UN volunteers and rolling it out across 86 different countries, and how they serve the UN system with volunteers when the greatest challenges are faced, natural disasters, war zones, whatever they may be. And humanity can rise, but is it sustainable? And what are the consequences of not doing so, or doing so but it being too long that you're doing it? So I think this challenge that we're facing is this level of intense energy that's required to do something transformational, to do radical adaptability. And what are perhaps some of the symptoms that you've seen that might be results, things like maybe the Great Resignation, or bits that people are facing at the moment of this requirement to be on top of alert of everything and to radically mess everything up and either cope or thrive depending on where you're at in the cycle? What are some of the symptoms, and how are the strategies that you've developed and the methodologies going to help to mitigate that on a sustainable basis? So just walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this morning. It's sort of like when you go to the gym, you lift some weights and you get a little bit of a pump, and your muscles are now bigger for a temporary reason. And then when you go back later in the day to your everyday, your muscles tend to go back to their normal situations and positions. And so it's normal to really react when you're putting a lot of exertion and pressure onto yourself. But the natural state of things, and gravity tends to actually pull us back to what our muscles want to do in stasis. And so our responsibility as individuals is to actually build up those muscles, not during the session at the gym, but rather when we are resting at home and when resting in sleep. And so the trainers will always tell you, if you go to the gym and you work out, then you should have a rest day, or give yourself some time so that your muscles can recuperate. And the idea is that your muscles now get stronger and they're bigger while they're resting rather than just at the gym. And it's the same kind of mentality when we're thinking about adaptability. And you're very familiar with this from your work. And when we were in the crisis situation of the pandemic, whatever it was over the last 2 years, whether it was the early days of the lockdowns or whether then it was thinking about supply chain issues that totally turned everything into a big mess worldwide. The key idea is that when you're running a radically adaptable team and organization, you're exercising agility in the moment, and you are running really hard in very small sprints to be able to solve a particular problem and get over a hurdle. That's really the heart of how you become radically adaptable. But like you said, the flip side of that is that that's exhausting. It's everybody has been tired of being on Zoom for so long. Everybody has been tired for constantly looking out for the next, gorilla or leopard that's going to jump out from behind the unseen rock and attack us. I'm saying this in a very metaphorical way in terms of the world. And so it's very exhausting to constantly running, constantly sprinting, and constantly having your amygdala turned on to trying to identify where the dangers are. And so it's actually really critical. What we discovered was that the rest period, like you rest after going to the gym, is really critical after you do something very transformative, even at work. And so you have to build this resilience within yourself and within your teams so that you can rest and you can build your muscle during that rest period, so that you're not struggling on the current hill that you're trying to climb, but rather you are better rested for the next hill that you have to climb. And one thing that was really clear to us in this research was that everybody thinks of resilience as an individual responsibility, and we all come to work with different levels of energies. Think of it as like your smartphone energy meter. Some people come with a really full day of energy because they have really supportive family and social structures. Some people come with charged up batteries because they have more financial resources, or they have other resources that other people don't. But we all come to work with different energy levels. Yet if we are working on a team to try to accomplish a particular project, our individual energy levels will impact how effective that team is. And so one of the key insights we had during the pandemic was that the most successful teams, not only was individual resilience and mental well-being and mental health important at an individual level, it was really critical for a team level. And so the most successful teams were those that were able to measure and diagnose their team's energy level on a consistent basis and see where things were slacking off and they needed to plug the phone back in to juice it up, and where they needed to bring in additional resources or support a team member. And the whole idea is that you're trying to cross the finish line together as a team, no matter what level of energy you independently bring to the conversation and to work. And there's some great exercises or practical things I can tell you about how to do that. But that was the real insight for us, is that you're running really hard in a crisis to transform, but it's just as important for you to have the rest to decompress, just like your muscles do after they go to the gym.
It's a bit like breathing, right? When you watch the 100-meter sprinters, some of them hold their breath for the 10 seconds or so that they do it. If you were doing that over and over again, you'd collapse. We need that space to breathe. We need to re-oxygenate, to refuel, to re-energize. And a lot of the challenge is then knowing who needs it, when they need it, and how do you plug them in, because like we know with phones, there's a blimmin' different adapter, different connection for every one of the phones, right? So in this complexity of work and of teams, of hybrid, of connection, of all of these things, is how are we given the environment? How do we facilitate and foster fertile ground for this to go on?
Yeah, and but I can give you two great examples.
Yeah, please.
To do. So one really easy question to gauge sort of where your team is at. And this is a fantastic way in any kind of small group setting that you have to identify sort of like how much, what's going on in someone's life, so that, you don't know, right now we're seeing into each other's living rooms and we can sort of see what's going on, but you may not know that I don't have childcare today. And all of a sudden, as a parent, that might be really stressing me out. And so that kind of conversation typically doesn't happen in this virtual format. And so it's really critical to figure out what resources and what things are going on in people's lives so that you can plug in that phone when you need to. So one really easy question to ask is, what's sweet and sour in your life today? And that question is all about what's sweet, what's happy, what's great for you today. And you can answer that in any way you want, professionally or personally. And what's sour? What's something that's not going as well as you had hoped it would go today? And why is that context important? It's important because as a team member, that helps you to gauge how someone's context is going to impact their particular work level and their individual capabilities that particular day. So that's a really good, like, easy thing, what's sweet and sour, that you can ask in any sort of conversation with a team member. And then the second thing is, there is a particular practice that you can, as a team leader, apply every few weeks to gauge your team's energy by actually asking a survey and asking, hey, on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you guys feel today? And you can go on Zoom, and everybody's on Zoom, or if you're in person, you can say, okay, I want you to rank from 1 to 5, 1 being really low, 5 is like, you're at Disneyland, it's like the best day ever. And people will, type in the chat, whatever that number is. Most people will ultimately be around, somewhere between 3 and 4, right? And the important thing to think about is, over time, if somebody has historically been around a 3 and 4, and they say, oh, I'm at a 1, that's a big aha, like, oh, what's going on in your life? And so we can sort of help diagnose, help you figure out what resources we can bring as a team to cross that finish line together. If you think about sort of big box retailers, if you go shopping at Walmart or Target, when you leave the store, there's often a little checkout stand that has 3 or 4 buttons on it with emojis ranging from red, unhappy face, to yellow, neutral face, to green, very happy face. And the point of this is that these stores are trying to measure consumers' sentiment inside their stores. And while this is not particularly 100% accurate, it's some sentiment. And by running a survey like this every 2 or 3 weeks, by asking your team, hey, where are you guys on a scale of 1 to 5? It's a similar way for team leaders to be able to diagnose in a very quick way where the team's energy level is, and what's not being said, and what do we actually need to try to, what's the pink elephant in the room that we need to try to diagnose. So these are just 2 really cool, easy, practical ways to diagnose and identify your team's resilience levels.
And when they've done that, and they've got baselines and they've got these outliers that are either aware enough to be able to say, I need help, through a feedback of a sour or a feedback of a 1 today. You mentioned these sort of 4 key attributes of leaders that both individually and teams tend to be more adaptable, tend to thrive in a case where it is unknown, where it is uncertain, where there is more, just chaos in our lives, inside or outside of work. What are some of those four things, Kian?
Yeah, sure. So we've talked a little bit about one of them, which is around resilience. But let me start with what I think is a couple of the more important ones. And they're all important, but it first starts with foresight. And it goes then into talking about collaboration and inclusion. The third one is agility, and the fourth one is resilience. And let me start with foresight. What does that mean? So I'm a futurist by training. I was an executive director at the XPRIZE for many years. And what we did was we designed moonshots to solve grand challenges and bring technology to create new solutions to problems that we had currently, but we didn't know how to solve them yet. And so as a futurist, you're trained to think about what are the possible future states of a particular industry of the world that can come to light, and how can you then work backwards from what you think this future state may be to then create a technology or a service that solves that particular problem. Now, foresight is exactly what we did for many years at the XPRIZE Foundation, to identify sort of where the world was going in terms of a particular domain or in terms of a particular trend in technology. And then we try to work backward from that. It doesn't mean that we can predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. And the truth is, the future is not linear. It's multiple in different kinds of ways. And so by learning to see around corners is a very, very practical tool for any organization and any team and any leader to try to anticipate what that change may be. Even if that situation or that scenario doesn't come to pass, it it builds that muscle for that team to be able to have different options when a situation comes to fruition. I'll give you an example. So in our research, we talked with the San Jose Sharks, which are a national hockey league. And when the first lockdowns came, excuse me, when the first lockdowns came in 2020, now these teams, obviously they play inside stadiums and the stadiums were closed. And so their entire revenue model is based on people going to a stadium and buying seats. And so they had, their revenue base dramatically plummeted. And so the CEO, Jonathan Becker, brought his leadership team together and said, okay, we don't exactly know what's going to happen week to week. So we are now going to think about what are the world of possible scenarios that can happen, and how do we prepare ourselves to act when and if those situations come to pass. So they crowdsourced within the team 30 different possible scenarios for the future. They voted together on the 10 most likely scenarios. And of those 10 scenarios, they then developed a one-page action plan of what the team and the company would do if that scenario were to come to fruition. And so now they were ready to actually act when things happen. And so they weren't reacting to change. They were actually anticipating this potential future. And so that was a really powerful tool for them to help identify new ways of building the franchise in the first days of the lockdown. And there's many different examples of this. The sad part, I'll be honest, is that not many people think like this, and not many organizations have a foresight practice or expertise. Sometimes they'll farm it out to a consulting firm, and we do some of that work through my own consulting firm. But I think it's really critical for teams to develop that internally. And in the book, we put together a very simple methodology where teams can learn how to do that and deploy that on a monthly basis, and then build that muscle for learning to see around corners. That I think is really, really critical. So that's one of them. Then the second one, and I'm happy to pause and answer questions if you want me to about any of these. The second one is around collaboration. And so we realized that in the pandemic, work wasn't about where you work, but rather how you showed up to work. And it wasn't about the physical distance that you had. Sometimes you were, previously in the same office building or the same cubicle space, but work essentially became about your distance from an affinity level between your coworkers and your teammates. And so the most successful teams were able to recognize that they needed to work differently. And it wasn't just like porting these technologies like Zoom and doing work the same way, but having these new tools. You actually had to apply and have different behaviors for working collaboratively in a remote world, in an asynchronous world, and be able to reach out beyond the confines of your team to get really, really good ideas. And so that was really critical. The third leadership trait is agility. And we talked a little bit about this, that the most radically adaptable teams are those that are constantly sprinting to solve a particular problem. And this idea from agility comes from software development, of agile software development, but it's not oftentimes deployed on a consistent basis and from a management perspective. And so how do you take the elements of developing something like software in an agile format and applying that to your own organization? And you do that by creating these very short sprints, usually 1 or 2 weeks, that allow you to solve a particular problem. And you have a stand up with your team every day, or a virtual stand up, to figure out what are the obstacles and how you can help them actually unblock some of those obstacles and get them to the finish line. And you keep iterating this every 2 weeks until you get to ultimately the longer goal you're trying to solve for. And as I mentioned, this is the heart of how do you run adaptable teams, but it can be exhausting. And so that's why the fourth element of radical adaptability is how do you build that team resilience and that team muscle for making sure that you all have enough energy to accomplish the task.
It's fascinating, isn't it, where these elements of practices that come from different areas that then put into a process and a set of principles can apply in all sorts of aspects. It can apply for a sports team, it can apply for a big, box retailer, or it could apply for our own lives and our own career. Is to think about on an individual basis, what is my own foresight? What could be those futures for me, so that I can lay them out and choose, and this opportunity to choose a destination, to choose things is interesting on an individual basis. And I think maybe that's what we're seeing a lot of the situation in work at the moment, of some huge challenges. We're seeing some massive, massive challenges, whether that is around, the Great Resignation, whether that is hybrid working, how to figure that out, linked up into some of the remote elements, whether that's things like well-being, mental health, work stress, because we talk with smiles, we talk with energy, we talk with abundance, and this language of this is great, adaption's great, innovation's great. For many people, that's a scary, fearful, stressful situation that manifests in lots of physical things, lack of sleep, maybe you get angry, that, there can be lots of things that come out of this disconnect from being where things were certain, things were known, to less certain and unknown. And those principles and those things that come into place, what are some of the challenges of actually applying that? So actually applying experimentation for somebody who just likes things to be the same way, and how can leaders help people who maybe are in that stage before they've left, before they've handed in and said, I'm done, I'm exhausted? How can they help people who aren't up for experimentation, innovation, all of these sorts of things? What's the way in which you've seen that work well?
Well, I think the truth is that nothing will ever be the same. And I don't mean that to be a glib comment, but change happens all the time, whether you want it or not. And so it's all about how we react to change and how we want to find our role within the broader macro context of the world. And so you might like things the way they are. And very soon you might find yourself, that situation no longer actually exists anymore. And you have to leave, not because you want to, but because you're forced to go find a different job or a different role because your job doesn't exist anymore. I mean, if you think back to the 1980s, the most predominant job in America was being a word processing assistant. And then all of a sudden we had software that came in and allow people to use services like Microsoft and others to accomplish a lot of the administrative tasks that they had personal assistants do the work for them. And those jobs went away. Well, those people didn't stop working. They had to find new work and they had to find new skills. And so this is not a new thing in history. It's something that we've dealt with for our entire human existence. It's just accelerating at a faster pace now than it has in the past. And I think that pace of change is what's freaking people out and saying, I just want to go back to the way things were. I want to keep things stable. And, we are 2 years into this pandemic, starting year 3, unfortunately now. And while things have opened up dramatically and things are improving, I've seen a lot of companies and organizations say, okay, it's time to go back to the office now. It's time to go back to work. And it's kind of insulting, actually, because we've been working for 2 years and we've been working very successfully for 2 years and sometimes stressfully, but we've made it work. And so to say, okay, time to go back to work, I just find that a really false assumption. And it actually really infuriates me when people say that, because we've been doing it for so long. But the reality is that, again, we talked about sort of muscles contract and they overcome major obstacles and lift weights, but then they have to relax. And once they relax, they tend to go to the status quo from the past. And that's what most leaders are now saying is, I want to go back to the way things were. You got to come back to the office however many days a week, and we're going to work things like this. Great, you might think that that's your mindset, but the reality is that the era has completely changed. We are never going back to work. We can only go forward to work. And there are organizations that are restructuring and rethinking their assumptions about what work is and how they want to get that work done to match the expectations of their employee base. The Great Resignation is happening because people are exhausted from the last 2 years. And then they realized the way we were working wasn't working. And I needed to change. And we did it because we were told for decades of 20th century industrial work, this is how you work. You work 9 to 5. You go to school, then you go to get a job, and then you work for 30 years, and then you retire. Well, that just doesn't work anymore. And the pandemic was a great break and great aha for us to really step back and reevaluate all of our assumptions about how we live, how we work, who we want to communicate with, how we socialize. And people have had this like massive shift in their lives. And just to tell them time to go back to the office and time to go back to work completely misses the last 2 years of personal transformation across the entire globe. And so this is why the Great Resignation is happening. Employees are saying, I don't want to work like that. Those values are no longer important to me. I've been awakened to what is important to me. And if you can provide that in a workplace environment for me to grow and to meet the expectations that I have in this post-pandemic environment, I'm going to go somewhere else. And employees are essentially becoming consumers of work, and they're saying, nope, not going to work here anymore because I don't like the way you run it. I don't like the values you have. I don't like the lack of purpose. I don't like the lack of inclusion. I don't like the lack of me being involved, having a voice in solving something together. So when you tell me to go back to the office, when you tell me to go back to work, I'm going to shove it and say, I'm going to go somewhere else because that is no longer what I want. And that to me is a great awakening instead of the Great Resignation. And so as CHRO leaders and CLO leaders and leaders in all of our organizations and coaches, it's our role to help bring along people who currently are saying, I just want to stay the way things were. I don't really want to change. Because if you don't change, change is going to happen to you. You're going to lose your greatest talent and your greatest resources because they're going to go find a different workplace environment that matches the needs for their expectations in this post-pandemic environment.
And it's the next transition, right? We had the first transition, and now it's not even, I want it to stay how it is now because that isn't sustainable. You know, we can't sustain that level of energy requirement for that transformation. It needs the next settling, you know, in the, you know, forming, norming, storming that we all have experienced. In terms of coming back to your story, Kian, and how you have made yours, you know, you've created your own, every role, every opportunity, every piece. What do you think it is that's made you personally maybe so adaptable, either to form an opportunity, to manifest an opportunity, or to mold yourself to utilize an opportunity that exists? What are some of the things that has made you that way?
Well, I remember a very distinct story, which I'll share with you. I had just graduated college, and I mentioned to you, I studied history, and I couldn't find a job, let's say an office job. I was 21 at the time, and so I was waiting tables at the Cheesecake Factory in Chicago, of all places. I worked through all college as a waiter, and I had just graduated, and it was the next fall, and it was Parents' Weekend, and so all the parents came in with the kids from I went to Northwestern, and all the kids had come in, and they were wearing all their college gear. It said Northwestern, you know, dad, Northwestern mom, and I was waiting tables on them. And so I would say, oh, welcome to Cheesecake. And also, so happy you're here for Parents' Weekend. And I'm a graduate of Northwestern. And so I'm really happy that you've come here today, this weekend. And one person said to me, wow, you work at the Cheesecake Factory after having gone to Northwestern University. What did you study? And I said, I studied history. And he said to me, this was a dad, and he said, oh, that's why you work here. And it had such a huge imprint on my thinking of how people believe jobs go, and how people should work, and what kind of careers are available to them. And to this day, you know, I tell the story 23 years later, it still infuriates me that that person told me that. But it actually was a really enlightening moment for me. And I realized then that I wasn't going to fit the context and the contours of what traditional people or traditional jobs expected of me. And so I had to be forced to go create my own opportunities. But you asked me what else, led me to this. And I would say, you know, I'm a child refugee. And so my family left Iran in the early days of a war with Iraq. And so, you know, first I was a refugee in Europe with my family for a while, and then we came to the United States, and I grew up here. I'm so grateful for all the abundance that I've been offered. But when you're an immigrant, especially when you're a child and you're taken out to a very different experience, you don't have any choice but to adapt in order to succeed. Like, you have to learn a new language, whether you like it or not. And you have to do different things, and you have to learn different values and different cultures. And that was obviously not something that I had anything to do with, but it was thrust upon me. And it just rewired my entire brain from early childhood, that has made me very comfortable being in uncertain environments, being in a whiteout in Black Rock City, in the middle of a desert at Burning Man. And another example I'll share with you was, I lived in London for many years. I mentioned to you, I went to grad school at LSE there, and then worked in venture capital. And then after a couple of years of living in London, this may sound ridiculous, but I got tired of London. And I wanted to go somewhere that had a lot more color. And I was just really excited to push myself, my boundaries. And I forget who was the author who said, when you're tired of London, you're tired of life. And that's sort of how I felt. And so I said, where can I go that I can get rejuvenated again? And so I actually won a fellowship to move to China and work for the first ever venture capital firm in China. And this is 20 years ago. And I didn't speak any Mandarin, but nobody in this company spoke English. And so I had no choice but to learn. And I was in this foreign environment that was so radically different than any culture I'd ever been in. And I had no choice but to adapt and survive. And that to me has been sort of the story of my life, of how I've done it. And I thrive in those kinds of environments, and I really enjoy it. And I respect that not everybody does enjoy that, because it is really pushing people to the boundaries. But what I've learned is that anytime I go out of my comfort zone, I'm learning something new. And while I may revert back to the rest period of my muscle after having gone to the gym, I've grown. And that to me is immensely important as a human, and I think will serve me well no matter what the future brings in terms of uncertainty.
It's really interesting, Kian, that you mentioned so many of these things, because the discomfort we feel, you felt it from an early age, not by necessarily choice, but by circumstance, that then built a tolerance for that then turned into a joy. From this sense of discomfort, I don't belong, I'm at a place, I can't communicate, in order to survive, I must repeat, to then going, this is now part of my identity. I can do any of these things. I've built confidence through going in somewhere where before I had the capability, I needed that courage. And therefore I've now got a new capability, a new level of competence. I can make a new commitment. Whatever that commitment is, I feel able to overcome. You remind me, I think, is Anusha from Iran as well. So you must have had quite a bit in common. XPRIZE, for those who don't know, she's the CEO now of XPRIZE, first female private citizen in space, as well. Amazing stories from her. And I think these opportunities of people that in our own stories and our own lives, who we look up to and who we are built by, is best when it's ourselves. When we're built by the version that we were before, and we look up to the version we're going to be of ourselves, and take inspiration, yes, from others, but not necessarily judge. And I thank you for sharing, some stories that I'm sure will have resonated with many people, and the confidence to just try, to just put yourself in a place where it may not work, but to try and to experiment. And from an organizational and team basis, that collective energy that comes when you keep on experiment, when you keep trying, is that it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be in discomfort. It's not going to feel nice, but the more you do it, the more it becomes, those muscles are able and ready for it. If people want to reach out to you, Kian, what's the best way that they can engage with you, get in touch? You mentioned the book is launched, that's on Amazon and all sorts of places, but to engage with you at Geolab, how do they do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at from the KGB. I'm not a Russian bot, so just note it's @from the KGB. I'm online on LinkedIn, available. I'm very active, and the book is available at leadersguide.org. Really proud of the research, and we're really hopeful that we can help create a movement for creating better teams, more purposeful work, more enlightened professions in this new era. And so I'm grateful for it. And for anybody who does get the book that's going on sale today, we have an 8-part video course that's available to anybody for free. If you purchase and send me a copy of your purchase, happy to send that to you. And so Ross, this has been really fun. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's my most favorite interview so far, because it was personal. And if I can give one recommendation to your listeners on a personal level, is that, like you said, change is hard. Adaptation is a reaction to change. And if you can think about how to anticipate and build that muscle for yourself, that will help you future-proof your own career and your own teams and your own organizations, no matter what technology comes. And for those of you who have kids in your audience, I would really push you to get your kids to do things that are hard for them, because that's ultimately going to give them that skill set and that confidence that they'll be able to adapt and pivot no matter what happens. At the XPRIZE Foundation, we always said that we try to make the impossible possible. And I like to say that I want to help make people turn their impossible to I'm possible. And because I really do believe that we have a untapped capacity for innovation and for generosity, and also for creating great new things if we let ourselves believe that we can do so.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And I look forward to many conversations with you, Kian. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQME assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams, and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review, and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.